Corey Hayden, and I'm faculty in anthropology and part of the customs community here. I'm really delighted to introduce Professor Lochlann Jain to our colloquium series this semester. Professor Jain is Associate Professor of Anthropology and STS at Stanford. She received her PhD in the History of Consciousness department at UC Santa Cruz in 1999. And I think you certainly see the marks of that interdisciplinary training in most of her work, and especially in this book, Malignant. Professor Jain has received funding for many of her projects from a wide range of institutions, from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the National Center for the Humanities, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral and Social Sciences at Stanford. Before I talk about her work, I think it's just important to say one thing, which is probably the most important thing to know about Professor Jain is that she is Canadian. And this matters. This matters, I think, in part because so much of her work is a really trenchant, astute set of diagnostics and musings on American culture, really, as understood through the cancer complex, we might call it, or through, as in her first book from 2006, Injury, through the kind of techniques of assigning blame, of thinking about culpability, of thinking about victimhood, of thinking about agency, not just through the law, but refracting all of these things through a kind of careful consideration of what it means to be a subject in American culture. And often, that also means in American capitalism in the current moment, right? And not in a reductive way, but the notion, a certain kind of capitalist formation, I think, is really central to many of the processes that Lochlann traces in her work. Now, many people know much of this work already, a kind of astonishing range of articles that really are kind of one-off classics in themselves. Cancer Butch, one of the most incredible ruminations on gender and sexuality, capitalism and cancer that any of us have ever read. Living in Prognosis, a couple pieces that form a kind of part of the scaffolding of this book. But also work from the work on injury, dangerous instrumentality, violent submission, and questions of time and the mortality effect. All of these articles in and of themselves kind of provide, I think Donna Haraway called in relation to your book, called it a gift, provide us with these incredible gifts of scholarship, of reflection, and critique in a really unique way. Now the book, Malignant, How Cancer Becomes Us, is its own kind of culmination, I think, of a number of these tendencies in your work. Tendency, I don't like that word, but of these capacities in the work to really get us to think critically, but never from a position of innocence or purity. And I think that's probably a legacy from Donna among many others. That it's very easy in a book about anything, about injury, or possibly about cancer, to point fingers and say, the car industry causes this, right? The energy industry causes this. The plastics industry is at fault. And so by identifying blame, one thinks one has grounds for anger and therefore grounds for redress. And I think the power of your work, both in Injury and here, is to remind us in a much more challenging way of the complicity of all of us in the processes that bring these things here, the question of cancer, that have made them actually central to American life, to economy, to society, to culture, to lived worlds and biographies. And it's that, the complexity of that message, and the fact that you're able to get that message out to people in such a readerly and writerly way, is an achievement in its own right. And I'm sure you all know the book is getting massive amounts of press and praise that it certainly deserves. from Nature magazine and Discover, giving it rave reviews. You've had pieces published in the Huffington Post. She's been on C-SPAN. That's exciting. On public radio across the country and the Stanford Medical School. Anyway, the word Lochlann is really not just thought about, but really enacted a kind of politics around engaging with the world through this book. And it's really, that too is an achievement. And so I want to just stop talking and let you talk and welcome you here and thank you for coming. Thanks.
Thanks, Corey. That's going to be something to live up to. And thank you all for coming. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. Some of you I've seen at other talks, so I don't know why you've come back. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book and bring together a couple of things in the book, and then hopefully we can have a little discussion about things, and I'll do a couple of readings as well. So one of the hardest things politically and emotionally and just analytically, I think, in talking about cancer is that it's really such a different thing for everybody. So a doctor might say, well, it's obvious, cancer is a set of dividing cells. And we can't cure most advanced cancers, but we're getting a little bit closer. But even then the word cancer will mean different things in different kinds of discussions. For example, in discussions around screening or discussions about palliative care. And it'll be different for a doctor looking at a 90-year-old than for a doctor looking at a 30-year-old, for example. It'll be different again for somebody who's serving as an expert witness in a courtroom trying to determine if a specific diagnostic error had any long-term bearing on a patient's outcome. Now, a cancer patient asked what cancer is might enumerate her physical, economic, and social losses, or might describe the humiliation of losing friends or the loneliness of a radiation treatment. A cancer survivor might speak of cancer in terms of odds that were beaten. So Lance Armstrong often responded to accusations around his drug use by diverting attention instead toward his cancer survivorship. So for him, oftentimes being a cancer survivor was a very clear identity. An industrialist interested in developing fracking or another industrial process might say, well, cancer's everywhere. There's absolutely nothing we can do about it. And that claim has been tremendously successful, actually, in court, even though one plastics executive, for example, in the 1960s, said that his company could conceivably be liable to the whole US population for the carcinogens in everyday plastics. A hospital might advertise cancer as something that they have special, unique insight into. But one often finds a sort of moralism that adheres to all of these positions. I'm a survivor. I cure cancer. And that's one of the things I'm really particularly interested in, because to me, this moralism often indicates some sort of boundary policing on the ways that we can talk about things. So indeed, there is an awful lot at stake in how we define cancer. There's money, there's lots of money, and there are a lot of people vying for a little piece of that cancer pie. There are ideas about progress, whether medical or industrial or national, and the ways that we can treat other humans in that goal of progress. There are many kinds of claims to expertise at stake. So as an anthropologist, I've aimed to understand cancer not as a noun then, but as a nexus of these kinds of concerns, economics and experiences. And so I sought out places at which these definitions of cancer collide. So when I say cancer, I mean both the disease that can kill us and a zone of powerful forces and assumptions, as well as an illness. So this approach is really different, I think, from that of historians or scientists or memoirists, in that I've worked to try and figure out the scientific and social structures that hold certain ideas about cancer in place, and how those lead to specific kinds of practices and ideas about responsibility and hierarchies. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. I looked in detail at various areas of law that deal with cancer, like medical malpractice law and law around toxic exposures and so on. And since graduate school, I've been particularly interested in how the specific injury of cancer slips through many of the legal protections that we're supposed to have against defective products. And this happens for a couple of different reasons, not just the power of some industries, but the lag time between exposures and disease can make it very hard to claim that a particular exposure led to a particular disease many years later. Then again, medicine produces data in very general terms, whereas courts require this specificity in linking the exposure to the cancer. So law provides one place that we can see these issues. And when we don't acknowledge the uncertainty at the heart of cancer, these different definitions can easily allow cancer to slip through these kinds of cracks. I'll explain what I mean by uncertainty in a second. So in addition to legal suits, I examined places such as retreats for cancer survivors, cancer activism, but also places that people tend to hold more sacred, such as randomized control trials or chemotherapy treatments. Places that one might hope and expect there to be a real there there at the center of these kinds of studies. And it's exactly these interstices that I believe that cancer can be found. But it's also at these places that I get, not surprisingly, the most kind of pushback. So I think there are several broader consequences to our lack of ability to really understand the uncertainty at the heart of cancer. And this is the uncertainty that randomized control trials tries to get at, because we don't know much about any particular cancer. We use population data to try and figure out what it is. So some of the consequences of that is we're less able to both distribute the costs of the disease and also to understand how those costs are distributed. We're less able to see and develop ways of addressing major issues such as medical misdiagnoses and toxic exposures. It's difficult to get inside of the logics of cause and effect to understand how our lack of data lays out subject positions for us and forces us to live within worlds of uncertainty, and that's what I want to talk about today. And it's extremely difficult to see the step further what kinds of actions those subject positions enable, what kinds of actions and violences. So I'm sure you all know that it took about 40 years before courts were able to hold tobacco companies responsible for the misrepresentation of cigarettes. That was one of the things I looked at in my graduate work was tobacco and that set of litigations. But my first up close and somewhat uncomfortable personal brush with cancer came in the form of my own path report when I was in my 30s. And it was that made me begin to think about cancer in a very different way, not just as obviously a kind of academic way of studying uncertainty, but actually as a culture and as a thing that people live within in different ways, in ways that I could never actually have imagined from my studies. And so even though I didn't think I'd ever be one of those people who wrote about my own personal experience in my academic work, I have become that person. So as I mentioned, I'm going to intersperse my talk with a couple of readings. And here's the first one from the introduction. This is one of the personal parts. The book, I'd say there's maybe 10% of the book that is has this kind of memoir-y flavor to it. A week after my diagnosis, following the first of several operations, my surgeon presented me with my pathology report. Abbreviated as PATH report, this description of the removed tissue joins other morsels of cancer lingo, such as the conversion of stomach-wrenching chemotherapy to the too familiar chemo, the more manageable METs or hotspots for life-threatening metastases. The doctor's meeting with me and my mom was especially awkward because my mother had been a student of his in a medical school class that had petitioned against his use of pornographic slides in his lectures. A clearly nervous medical student joined the quartet. Dr. Slideshow had surely had similar interactions hundreds of times. The patient's questions hastily drawn on scrawled on slips of paper, based on half-understood newspaper articles summarizing medical trials. The uneasy smiles, the vague attempts at reassurance. The physician's role in going over the path report must get tedious. Despite the shock and horror for the patient, cancer treatments are fairly rote, based on ludicrously few variables. My path report began with a description of the original tissue. In the fresh state, the specimen weighs 683 grams. I pictured the lump of flesh on a Weight Watchers scale, ready for dissection. From the description of what had been my tissue, the report rapidly narrowed into a series of inscrutable markings and scores. It indicated how many lymph nodes contained cancer and how many and what size the tumors were. At that time, I had only the vaguest notion of cancer. So far in my brief cancer life, it had been a conglomeration of humiliation, shame, a thing that threatened my shot at tenure, and random concerns about artificial sweeteners and nonstick pans. The path report, in contrast, represented cancer as a set of numbers. The image of a computer converting lines of poetry into zeros and ones flashed through my mind. The path report rendered my flesh into data points comparable to other people's flesh, and from there into a mountain of evidence about various treatments. By the time treatment ended, the specimen would be far from fresh, so the mobile path report came in handy. I took it to the members of my cancer circle, the many specialists who could translate the numbers into their expert languages, and later, in considering a medical malpractice suit for 3 years of misdiagnosis, to my attorneys. The report became a vector connecting me to all the bureaucracies each represented. My flesh had become the pathology report, portioned, sliced, flattened into slides, observed, categorized, and finally rendered into this emailable document. The italicized type and banal officiousness of the path report served as my portal into an entirely new world, one Susan Sontag lavishly described as the kingdom of the ill. My journey to this kingdom differed from the romantic tradition of my discipline, anthropology, whose research trips require years of language preparation and mythic days floating down pristine rivers in dugout canoes. The moat I crossed to take up my new residence was more like a silty, crocodile-filled gorge with no paddle in sight. Not only does cancer work through the metaphors of metastases, recurrence, and remission, but it is also at one moment a paper trail, at another an identity. At one place a statistic, and at another a bankruptcy. Here a scientific quandary, there a transcendent image of a cell. One person's losses offer another a chance to leave a mark on humanity. A body image taken offers another to be found. The project of making cancer as plural as it is singular, as vast as it is microscopic, as diffuse and discrepant as it is descriptive, resonates under one word. The simple noun cancer consolidates this achievement. So the path report, which led to Prognosis, as it does for many people, was the first way in which cancer became abstracted for me as a patient. That's what I'm trying to get at in that excerpt. And in many other parts of the cancer world, one finds that abstracted data is kind of reconfigured and then fed back to one in various ways, often in protocols, treatment protocols that can give treatment the sort of assembly line feel that many cancer patients try to describe. And it's this reconfiguration of this experience and this tissue into data that I want to talk about today. So ultimately, I wrote the book for two reasons. First, I was fascinated and somewhat horrified by how we misunderstand and sort of refuse to deal with the uncertainties around both cause and treatment. And most often we think about uncertainty as a gap in our knowledge that we're working hard to fill. But cancer provides, I think, a really poignant place to examine uncertainty because we've been unsure for so long about how it's caused and how we can cure it. And this paradox between the body and the data is lived with such high and horrific with such high stakes and in horrific ways that then reflect back in how the research is done. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in how that happens and in how uncertainty is really a structuring principle of how we understand cancer. So in that way, I think cancer can be used in this bigger project of reflecting back on American institutions and values. Second, I was just simply totally confused by this radical separation between the cause and the treatment of cancer that one finds kind of everywhere. Oncologists virtually never talk about cause, and the chemical and military establishments rarely talk about the nitty-gritty of cancer and treatments. I'm going to let the slide do some of the work of explanation there. So today I want to introduce one way I've been thinking about prognosis as one of the artifacts that poses as a sort of concrete fact in this sea of uncertainty, and then trace that back into thinking about randomized controlled trials and the costs, the human costs of data production. So after I studied all of the charts that I could that were associated with my own prognosis, I talked to my doctor about, what it means. I brought these charts in and I said, so what does this mean? And he said, well, exactly what it says. And, of course I get that. I got that at the time. It's a chance, it's a prognostic number, it's written in the form of a percentage. But there's also something sort of incredibly mysterious and existential about that number, about getting that number, or having someone you know or love getting that number. So I'll just read another little excerpt. An attorney friend of mine, Mary Dunlap, who died in 2003, wrote a book-length manuscript while living with cancer entitled, Eureka, Everything I Know About Cancer I Learned from My Dog. Ever the optimist, Mary found hope in her dismal prognosis for pancreatic cancer, if 5% survival chance wasn't, after all, nothing. In the last chapter of her book, she handwrites, on Monday, Maureen, her partner, and I were confronted with the news, predictable to many but surprising to us, that the cancer discovered in my pancreas has moved into my liver. Today, I am an asymptomatic person with an almost invariably deadly cancer. When Mary found that her cancer had spread, had indeed been spreading, her health status retroactively shifted. In one swift motion, the cancer prognosis detonates time, which scatters like so many jet glass shards. Having harbored cancer in one's body all of that time before diagnosis, when one thought one was quite well, thank you, mystifies both past and future. One young blogger who identified herself only as Cancer Baby wrote as she was dying of ovarian cancer, the vernacular drones constantly, and for those who speak it, the talk is loose as it should be. Rendered mute, you can only listen to the din. It swirls around you, looping endlessly in patterns and figures you can't quite recognize. A language you once studied but can't master. Many people who I've spoken to who've gone through cancer diagnosis echo this sentiment. Unable to specify with certainty the behavior of any one particular cancer, oncology relies instead on statistics. Cancer and prognosis form oncology's double helix. Patients might receive a prognosis at a doctor's visit or look them up in books and charts. Others may not want to know how they line up before the firing squad of statistics. One rarely knows if treatment has ended for good or if a next round with palliative rather than the cure box will be checked in the medical treatment forms. A prognosis seems like a fact, if only a scrap of flotsam frenziedly bobbing in the rapids of cancer treatment. But its stunning specificity, 34.7%, shields the bloodlessly vague platitude. In 5 years, you, yourself, will either be dead or alive. The prognosis purees the I alive, you dead person with the fundamental unknownness of cancer and gloops it into the general form of the aggregate. The individual cookie cut from the cookie dough is both prognostic subject and cancer object. Living in prognosis severs the idea of a timeline in all the usual ways we orient ourselves in time, age, generation, and stage in the assumed lifespan. If you're going to die at 40, shouldn't you be able to get the senior discount at the movies when you're 35? Does the senior's discount reward a long life or proximity to death? Sometimes comfort lies in data. Taking numbers at face value, prognosis offers mortality odds that can potentially be beaten. Other times when data feel vacant, literature provides a different sort of clue about the mysteries of living outside of normal time. Data and narrative each have their place, although neither ever really assuages the stupefaction of living in prognosis. Oh, and just, so I'm kind of talking about this counterfactual and the way that a prognosis can shift your relation to time, and I won't talk about it, but here are just a couple of other examples of how in the cancer ephemera and artifacts we see this kind of idea that everything could always have been a little bit different if there was an earlier detection or if there was a treatment that worked, and so on. So some people might want to say that the problem with the prognosis is simply a matter of doctor and patient communication. But I want to suggest that there's a way in which trials undergird and even kind of spit out these diagnoses and prognoses that, that lead to a different kind of way of understanding the hierarchies and the physician and patient roles. And here, I'll just do one more final reading and then continue with my talk here. The noted biologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote something of a how-to-survive statistics guide after his diagnosis with abdominal mesothelioma. In the median is not the message, Gould shows us that hope can be found in the right skew of a curve that describes his own gloomy odds, in which half of those diagnosed will die within only 8 months. And this is the graph that he published with his article in Discover magazine a few years ago. The gradually declining curve on the right, though, indicates that some of those who survive the first 8 months will live for years and even decades. As he points out, there isn't much room for the distribution's lower or left half. It must be scrunched up between 0 and 8 months. Everyone hopes to be represented by the right side of the graph, which floats gradually back down and eventually correlates with those few who live out a normal lifespan as they die. Gould did indeed remain in that latter. The early 20th century novelist Hilaire Belloc wrote of sterility over death. In my estimation, the victory can be experienced in the plummeting feeling of the search for oneself in the graph, or the victory. The graph encourages a self-centered search for oneself in the way that previous versions of survivorship would not brook. Okay, so in the book, I move from there to think about prognoses in more detail and to look at how people in literature and cancer survivor groups understand prognoses and numbers. But here I'm going to skip over that to talk about the relation of this to randomized control trials. So this pamphlet offers an attempt to recruit patients with late-stage and metastatic renal cancer for a randomized control trial. And the pamphlet's interesting in its very banality, in a way. It takes a very standard form of kind of asking an imagined array of questions that patients might have and then answering them. And I find the most striking question here to be this one of what happens if I get the placebo and then Trovax, this drug, is shown to work? And the response is, if the study shows Trovax prolongs survival and you receive the placebo, you will be given the opportunity to be treated with Trovax following regulatory approval. So of course, this is misleading at best. The 5-year survival rate for renal cancer is very, very low. Regulatory approval, as you know, takes forever. And in fact, this particular trial was canceled, as most of them are in early phase trials. And still, you know, the patient has to decide, based on this kind of information, whether to partake in the trial. And as we know, patients at this stage of disease are often quite desperate to do anything. I met a 20-year-old at a cancer retreat who said, you know, if my doctor told me to eat pine cones, I'd do it. You know, like that's how people think about this stuff, and that's how people trust their doctors. And you can imagine if doctors started prescribing pine cones, how expensive they'd become. But I often found in my research that people would say, you know, rather than saying I need a cure, they would say I need a trial. That's the extent to which these two are allied. And indeed, trials depend on promising this hope, as well as promising, as I found in some of the recruitment meetings I would attend, in kind of convincing people that they would partake in this project of fulfilling the greater good. Do it for the greater good of society, for the people who will come after you. Now, you might have other questions that aren't asked or answered in that Trovax pamphlet. What if I were in the Trovax group and it was not shown to work? Or if it was shown to work but with impossibly brutal side effects? Or, will I be paid for my time, which should be expensive, since there isn't much time necessarily left. Now, there are many ways to think about randomized control trials, and a lot of my colleagues in anthropology have done incredible work on randomized control trials. And often they take these kinds of forms. How should we structure the relationship between the dying person and the corporation or the doctors, which is, to a certain extent, a regulatory issue. Or how do we determine endpoints? Should it be that they're less expensive, or should it be a quality of life issue, or better overall survival issue? And what should those endpoints be? And we saw some of that for those of you who followed the Avastin debates a couple of years ago. And then, politics of funding question. So critiques of randomized controlled trials often take these kinds of forms. That's to say, the problem is not the RCT itself, but the uses to which it's put. I want to think about it just slightly different. I want to think about it as a way of structuring knowledge that then loops back into having highly consequential ways of laying out patient and doctor communications, and also the human costs of this kinds of research. So let me turn to another illustration. I attended this talk a few years ago at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Conference, and this fellow, Dr. Dowsett, made this comment that was really, really interesting, I thought. It was a way of acknowledging his research subjects, and it was quite unique. Most doctors at the conference and other conferences I've been to don't do that. But he says 1,050 people would have to relapse before we had the data. So, there's an obvious way in which this kind of statement translates the lives into the data. There's a language of, we'd have to, that indicates a sort of natural phenomenon. And of course, the deaths occur in both groups, in both the treatment and the non-treatment groups. And he foregrounds a fact that's usually left unsaid. That's that the trials need, indeed they sort of wait for, these cancer recurrences of their participants. So there's a paradox there, and researchers know this, and they try to soften that paradox by noting that the recurrences would have happened anyway, and they're just there to sort of count them up. And many scientists claim and recognize that this method requires the objectification of patients, and that it is just simply an unfortunate side effect of this way of doing research. And that's true. Still, a subject in the trial may still hope to be in the non-recurrence group. And so it's hard to imagine that the subject of a trial would make this kind of a statement, right? So in one way, this kind of idea or paradox of the randomized control trial and its relation to people going through is totally obvious. One person has to do the counting. There's a survivor researcher who does the counting, and the others have to be counted. Those are the survivor patients and the non-survivors, right? So it's totally obvious, totally logical. And it's such a familiar logical framework that it's even hard to see the effects of how it constitutes each party. So it's a logic very familiar to us through ideas of war. There are two sides. They kill each other, they compete, they out-injure each other. It's a logic of sport. Who can score the most goals? Who can go the fastest? And so on. And of course, cancer has a unique relationship to trials because of the trials' limited success historically in cancer research, because of the vast numbers of people involved in these trials. Because the treatments don't work very well, they need many, many people enrolled so they can even get that small difference. Because of the extreme toxicity of many of the treatments for patients, extreme drug profits, and, as I mentioned, the incremental survival benefits. So in another way, this logic is not at all obvious. There's a kind of temporal paradox, and those of you who've read your Foucault will be familiar with that idea of sacrificing oneself for the collective living on. So to return to this idea of the war, bodies on both the winning side and the losing side of the Civil War have been explained as the price of freedom. So in that sense, these deaths have gained a mobility and also a nobility of attribution. So once somebody dies and that death is counted, it can be used in the support of many different kinds of interests. Specifically the interest of the value of the entire project of accumulating this data. So similarly in randomized control trials, this data is separated from the bone and blood bodies. So I want to make this point the point I want to make by offering you kind of a different example, one that will take out the factor of illness altogether, because I think the illness also has a way of joining this logic of the future promise. So let's say I'm going to stand on top of this tunnel, and I'm going to ask each of you to step inside that tunnel. Now, I'm going to tell you that I don't actually know what's going to happen in there, but based on my previous observations, about 50% of you will make it through. And as you pass underneath me, I'm going to sprinkle some powder on you. It's going to be either white or blue. And I'm going to then go stand on the other side of the tunnel, and I'm going to count those of you who come out, and I'm going to just track whether or not you have white or blue powder on you. Now, as it happens, I'm sure like most of you in this room, all of you in this room, but for this project, that actually doesn't matter, and lots of things don't matter. It doesn't matter why you're going through it. It doesn't matter who drove you to the tunnel. It doesn't matter if you're a strong or weak person in mind or body. Your education and intelligence doesn't really matter, and your flaws don't matter either. In fact, it doesn't really even matter if you make it to the other side or not. All that really matters is that you're a body, and that you're going through the tunnel, and that you'll have a collar of powder on top of you. So I'll get the data, no matter how many people make it through, and I'll be able to take it to the NSF and get funding, maybe I'll get a promotion, and so on. So, you know, you probably don't like this experiment, and I don't blame you. In fact, you probably wouldn't go through the tunnel unless I told you that this room was about to explode or something. And then if you did, you know, if I did say that, you'd have to decide if you're going to trust me or not. And you'd have very little to go on except for the fact that I'm standing up here. So in many ways, this randomized control trial kind of echoes this random call. And of course, we want to think that the randomized control trial works in the service of a better future for everyone, and it gives the chance of a better life for the people who go through it, and ultimately a cure. But my point with this kind of ridiculous thought experiment is, what do we miss by going to those endpoints so quickly, by buying so fully into its promise? Because bodies lent to the cause of science suffer in many cases greatly, and cancer patients suffer greatly from both standard and experimental treatments. And we see this in numerous occasions. In the book, I talk specifically about high-dose chemotherapy experiments, a drug called anthracyclines, and also Avastin. So the question becomes, is it enough to send people into the tunnel just because they're sick? In that way, I think that RCT ignores its own forms of violence and its permission to harm. So despite the recruitment rhetoric, which we see here in another form of recruitment advertising, the randomized control trial itself as a form exceeds the participants' ability to compete. I told you all of the things that are factored out when you're going through that tunnel, all those things that don't matter, despite all the rhetoric of heroism and survivorship in cancer discourse. So ethicists make the required trade-off point this way. In order to give society the progress it demands for the future, we carry out clinical trials in which our patients of today become research subjects. So at this point, if I were a doctor, I'd want to start defending myself by using, some of the points that I mentioned. Often trials work, we have to do something, and so on. And I do believe that all that is true. But I also think it makes sense to figure out some of the downsides, how they set up hierarchical relationships between us, how they've organized an understanding of cancer through the ways these numbers travel, through, for example, prognoses, how the injuries of treatments are often relegated to side effects, and the dissonances between the collective and the individual. And also how we miss stacks and stacks of information by constantly cutting out factors that should be really important in this medical project of figuring out cancer. Why cancers are diagnosed oftentimes so late. What happens to the 1 in 8 Americans who live near Superfund sites? It makes sense to try and understand how these are not just unfortunate byproducts in the cancer communities, but critical to the ways in which cancer manifests and to the ways in which we've come to understand cancer when we look for a cure. So a colleague of mine, Elaine Scarry, once asked the question, why wage war? She suggests, I think this is so brilliant, she suggests that a chess game could equally well settle an international dispute as well as war could if all parties agreed, to the terms. And she works through this notion that it's not just injury that's necessary in war, but also that out-injuring turns out to be the crucial aspect. So to win a war, your side has to have injured more than it has been injured. But interestingly, out-injuring is also the key omission in most accounts of war. So to come back to this question of the Civil War dead, no one mentions like infected bayonet wounds and inauguration speeches when a president might speak of those who died for this historic day. In its parallel mission to out-heal, oncology literature glosses over too often the injuries produced through trials in its narrative of hope and aggression. So the prognosis is sometimes that first jolt with the experience of being absorbed into a number. And it's this number that gives each person in that medical office I cited at the very beginning of my talk a role. On the one hand is the counter, and on the other is the counted. But they need each other, but they definitely stand on different sides. So again, I want to come back to this question of uncertainty and think about the consequences of this form of knowledge and the form of knowledge that it presents to us without acknowledging the uncertainty at the very heart of it. How the knowledge structures the hierarchies that we experience in the diagnostic room and in the consideration of doctors as a broader cultural species of person, and how the randomized control trial enables certain kinds of physical violence, what uncertainty means in these creations of frameworks of meaning, and how we're all asked to pretend that this illness of cancer then doesn't exist in a way. We're asked to wear makeup, we're asked to have a sense of humor, we're asked to all be survivors. And I think I want to end there and open this up for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got plenty of time for questions.